There are moments in history when an entire nation must walk through darkness to reclaim the light. Today, we journey back in time, turning the pages of blood and tears to witness the true power of courage and the unbreakable longing for freedom. It is late on the night of August 18th, 1944. Paris is not the radiant city of lights it once was. Tonight, its brilliance is reduced to a ghostly silver, illuminated only by a reluctant moon that filters through the clouds. The avenues that once glittered with cafe chatter and jazz now lie in a silence broken only by the distant rumble of artillery. That low thunder rolls across the rooftops closer every evening, as if the war itself is marching toward the heart of France. A strict curfew has descended like a shroud. From midnight until 6 in the morning, Paris is ordered into silence. The shutters of homes are drawn tight. Curtains thick and dark are pulled across every window to blot out the faintest candlelight. Even the glow of a cigarette, once a symbol of Parisian nonchalance, can be a death sentence if glimpsed by the eyes of a German patrol. And those patrols are everywhere, boots striking the cobblestones in perfect rhythm, leather straps creaking, the metallic clatter of rifles echoing through alleys that have forgotten the sound of laughter. Through this shadowed cityscape, a small French family moves like ghosts. The mother cradles her newborn, its tiny breath warm against her chest. Her husband walks beside her, carrying rolled-up blackout curtains under his arm. Their eldest son, no more than 12, clutches his father's coat, eyes darting nervously at every corner. For them, a single wrong turn could mean disaster. One glimpse of German steel, one question shouted in clipped German, and everything life, family, future could shatter. They pause. The boy stumbles on a loose cobblestone, the sound sharp as a gunshot. All three freeze, their hearts pounding in their throats, listening for the dreaded command. Halt. But the boots pass by, fading into the night. The mother tightens her hold on her infant, whispering a prayer into the baby's hair. The father takes his son's trembling hand and, with quiet authority, guides his family deeper into the labyrinth of streets that twist and coil like a maze designed to entrap them. Paris itself seems to be holding its breath. The Seine flows silently, its dark waters swallowing the moonlight. The Eiffel Tower looms in shadow, not as a beacon, but as a skeleton against the night. The cafes of Montmartre are shuttered, their chairs stacked and tied with chains. The air smells of damp stone and smoke, with the occasional whiff of burnt rubber drifting from some distant barricade. And yet, behind closed doors, behind those heavy blackout curtains, life refuses to die. Families whisper stories by candlelight, sharing crusts of bread and bowls of thin soup. Children ask questions their parents cannot answer. When will Papa come back from the camps? When will the Germans leave? When will Paris shine again? The father knows he cannot answer, but he knows something else. He knows the sound of the artillery is not German fire. It is Allied fire rolling closer every day. Somewhere beyond the horizon, men from Britain, from America, from Canada, from free France are pushing forward inch by inch to reclaim the soil of his homeland. Somewhere beyond the horizon, liberation is stirring. And so he keeps walking calm despite the pounding in his chest. Every step is a gamble, every shadow a threat. But in that moment, as the family slips into the darkness of an alleyway, he carries something heavier than the blackout curtains, heavier even than the fear pressing down on his shoulders. He carries hope, the one contraband the Nazis cannot seize. The night before liberation, Paris is still a prison, but a city that once lit up the world with art, philosophy, and revolution has not forgotten who it is. Beneath the silence lies a heartbeat waiting for the dawn. To understand the desperation of Paris in August 1944, we must go back 4 years earlier to the summer of 1940, a summer that shattered the illusions of a nation once thought unconquerable. On June 22nd, in the quiet of a railway carriage in Compiègne, France, signed an armistice with Nazi Germany. The scene was laced with deliberate cruelty. Adolf Hitler had chosen the exact same railway car in the exact same forest clearing, where in 1918, Germany had been forced to accept its own humiliation at the hands of France and its allies. Now the roles were reversed. Hitler sat in the very chair once occupied by Marshal Ferdinand Foch, savoring his revenge as French officials signed their defeat. With the stroke of a pen, France was cut in two. To the north and along the Atlantic coast, German troops imposed direct occupation. Paris, the jewel of Europe, the city of enlightenment, was swallowed whole by the gray machine of the Reich. To the south, Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun in the First World War, accepted the role of leading a puppet regime based in Vichy. His government promised to preserve French sovereignty, but in truth, it acted as a collaborator, a shield behind which the occupiers could plunder and control with less effort. Italy, too eager not to be left out of the spoils, was granted a thin slice of southeastern France, a token participation award for Mussolini's late arrival to Hitler's conquest. For the French people, the partition was more than geographic. It was spiritual dismemberment. The idea of France as a unified nation, the same France that had marched proudly from the Revolution to the trenches of 1914, seemed to collapse overnight. The speed of the fall bewildered the world. Only weeks earlier, Parisians had believed the Maginot Line, a massive wall of fortifications stretching along the German border, was impenetrable. They remembered their fathers' stories of World War I, where the German advance had been halted and pushed back. But in May 1940, the German Blitzkrieg lightning war tore through Belgium and the Ardennes with a fury no one had expected. Columns of tanks and motorized infantry bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line, moving with terrifying speed. French defenses built for the trench warfare of 1914 crumbled under the weight of modern mechanized assault. The collapse was more than military, it was psychological. Millions of civilians, terrified of the advancing Wehrmacht, poured onto the roads in a desperate exodus southward. Entire families pushed carts filled with whatever they could carry. Roads jammed with bicycles, wagons, livestock, children crying, mothers clutching infants. In the skies above, German planes swooped low, strafing the columns of refugees, turning roads into rivers of panic. By June 14th, German soldiers were marching under the Arc de Triomphe, their boots drumming across the Champs-Élysées. The swastika flew from the Eiffel Tower. The City of Light had fallen without a fight. For many Parisians, the trauma was not only in defeat, but in the sense of betrayal. France, once proud of its army, seemed to crumble in weeks. Soldiers were still fighting heroically along the Maginot Line and in the Alps, but their sacrifices were drowned beneath the tide of surrender. Marshal Pétain addressed the nation, his voice trembling with age, asking his people to lay down their arms. For a population exhausted by the First World War, his words offered a bitter comfort. "It is with a heavy heart that I tell you we must stop fighting." Some saw wisdom in his resignation, believing further bloodshed futile. Others saw cowardice, a betrayal of France's honor. In Paris, the reality of occupation set in quickly. German soldiers patrolled the boulevards, their uniforms pressed, their weapons gleaming. The cafes still opened their doors, but the best tables were suddenly reserved for officers of the Wehrmacht. The city that had once prided itself on its resistance to tyranny now seemed to host tyranny as a guest of honor. The humiliation was palpable. For the French, the occupation was not simply a matter of politics, it was a daily intrusion into their private lives. The German command moved swiftly to impose their will. The armistice had been designed not only to weaken France militarily, but to reduce it to a convenient granary and factory for Hitler's empire. As soon as the ink was dry, orders poured in from Berlin: requisition food, seize raw materials, drain the economy of its strength, and feed it into the German war machine. And then came the small cruelties, subtle psychological reminders that France was no longer master of her own fate. The most infamous was the decree that all French clocks be moved 1 hour forward to match Berlin time. On the surface, it seemed trivial, even bureaucratic. But for Parisians, it meant waking and working in darkness, feeling time itself stolen. Dawn came later, and so did hope. Children trudged to school in the pre-dawn gloom. Workers stumbled to their shifts with the stars still overhead. The rhythm of daily life had been rewritten by foreign decree. One Parisian diarist wrote bitterly, "Even the sun no longer belongs to France." In cafes, whispers passed from table to table about the approaching allies. But those whispers were muffled by the fear that any voice might be overheard. Listening to the BBC's Radio Londres became an act of defiance. Families gathered in secret curtains drawn tight as a familiar British accent cut through the static "Ici Londres, les Français parlent au français." The words were more than information, they were a lifeline proof that the outside world had not forgotten them. The Germans, of course, forbade these broadcasts. To be caught tuning in could mean arrest, interrogation, or worse. Yet radios flickered in hidden kitchens and shuttered attics spreading news of Allied victories in Africa and Italy, and eventually in Normandy. It was dangerous hope, but hope nonetheless. Even as Parisians clung to whispered rumors and smuggled news, the city filled with reminders of their conquerors. Thousands of German soldiers flooded into Paris, many of them young men on leave from the front. They swaggered down the boulevards, frequenting theaters, dance halls, and brothels. For them, Paris was a playground, a vice, a place to drown the horrors of the Russian front in wine, women, and jazz. They sent crates of cheese, wine, champagne, and perfumes back across the Rhine to their families in Germany. Even the lowest paid private could indulge like a baron thanks to the fixed exchange rate that made French francs nearly worthless against the Reichsmark. The French watched with clenched fists as their goods vanished. The hotels of the wealthy, the Ritz, the Crillon, the Majestic were seized and turned into headquarters for Nazi officers. What had once been salons of art and philosophy now echoed with guttural orders barked in German. Priceless works of art were pried from the walls of museums and private collections boxed up and shipped eastward. Paintings by Da Vinci, Van Gogh, and Monet disappeared into the Reich's vaults intended for Hitler's Dream Museum in Linz. In a cruel twist of fate, the nation that had once plundered Europe under Napoleon now found itself the plundered. For ordinary citizens, the occupation was a slow suffocation. One could not walk freely after dark. One could not speak freely on the street. Even a misplaced joke, even a raised eyebrow at the wrong moment could be interpreted as hostility toward the occupiers, a crime punishable by arrest, deportation, even execution. Fear became the air Parisians breathed. And yet, beneath that fear, something else was beginning to stir. Resentment quiet at first, like an ember under ash. Because France had surrendered, but the French had not. The nation had been split in two, but its spirit was still searching for a way to rise. The stage was set. The curfew bells tolled, the boots marched, the city starved. And all the while, the distant thunder of Allied guns grew louder. The fall of France was complete. But history has always had other plans. When the German army marched into Paris, their victory was not sealed only by bayonets and tanks. They wanted something deeper, something psychological. They wanted to bend time itself. One of their first decrees after the occupation was deceptively simple. Every clock in Paris must be set forward by 1 hour to align with Berlin time. On paper, this seemed harmless, even practical, for an empire that now stretched across much of Europe. But for the Parisians, it was a cruel and calculated humiliation. Time was sacred to the French. The rhythm of their days, the ringing of church bells at dawn, the bustle of market mornings, the late-night glow of cafes on the Boulevard Saint-Germain was woven into the fabric of their identity. To be forced to live by Berlin's clock was to be told every waking hour, you are no longer your own. The change disoriented people in subtle ways. Mothers woke their children while the sky was still black, sending them stumbling half asleep to school. Workers trudged through the misty boulevards before dawn, their stomachs empty, their bodies moving like shadows. Darkness lingered longer in the mornings and night seemed to descend too quickly, cutting short what little joy could be found in the day. Time itself felt stolen like another rationed commodity handed over to the occupiers. In memoirs written after the war, Parisians recalled how the forced change seemed to warp the city. Even the sun is no longer ours, wrote one Parisian diarist. We rise in the night, we sleep in the twilight, and Berlin dictates our hours. The clock no longer beats to the rhythm of Paris, but to the boots of the occupier. This manipulation of time was only the beginning. Soon, a web of rules and restrictions was thrown over the city. The possession of firearms became illegal. Harboring escaped prisoners of war carried the death penalty. Listening to any foreign radio station was forbidden, especially the broadcasts of the BBC, which spoke directly to the French with coded messages and songs. Posters warned Radio Londres, c'est la mort. Yet behind shuttered windows, families would gather in silence, straining to catch the crackling voice of Charles de Gaulle, urging them not to give up, promising that France would rise again. In those moments, people rediscovered their dignity. They passed messages and whispered jokes in coded graffiti scratched onto alley walls, arrows pointing to secret resistance meetings, crude caricatures mocking Hitler and his men. Soldiers patrolled with rifles slung across their shoulders, but they could not erase every trace of Parisian defiance. Still, the presence of the occupiers was suffocating. They swarmed the streets in their gray-green uniforms, their tanks parked along the boulevards, their officers striding confidently into cafes and demanding the best tables. The Ritz, once the haunt of Coco Chanel and Hemingway, became the unofficial headquarters of Hermann Goering when he visited. The Hotel Majestic on Avenue Kléber was transformed into the Gestapo's command post. To enter was to vanish. Families whispered the names of friends who had disappeared behind its doors, never to return. Parisian life continued, but it was life twisted out of shape. Couples no longer strolled freely along the Seine after midnight curfews forbade it. Shopkeepers rationed their goods, shelves grew empty, and the famous French markets, once overflowing with cheeses and meats, became grim places of scarcity. Lines stretched down streets, people clutching ration cards, hoping for a scrap of butter or a few ounces of bread. And yet, in the midst of this deprivation, the paradox of occupation was cruelly visible. German soldiers, even the lowest-ranking privates, enjoyed a luxurious abundance. Thanks to the fixed exchange rate of 20 francs to 1 Reichsmark, an artificial valuation imposed by Berlin, a soldier's pay modest by German standards, was enough to buy wine pastries, perfume, and delicacies in bulk. They sent parcels of French goods home to their families in Germany. Baggage trains trundled eastward loaded with hams, cheeses, silks, and even looted works of art. For the French, it was a bitter spectacle. They saw their own children going to bed hungry while foreign soldiers feasted on butter and cream. They saw their own treasures paintings by Van Gogh, Cézanne, and Renoir crated up and shipped across the border, destined for the walls of German museums or the private collections of Nazi elites. The Louvre was stripped of masterpieces, though curators risked their lives to hide some in the countryside, concealing canvases in barns and cellars to preserve the nation's cultural soul. This theft was not random. It was systematic, directed from the highest levels of the Reich. Goering himself visited Paris, striding through galleries with a gloved hand, pointing to whatever pleased him and declaring, "That one will be mine." Priceless works of art vanished, many never to be recovered. But art was not the only target. Metals, textiles, coal leather food, anything of value was taken. The occupiers drained France like a carcass, stripping it for parts to feed their own insatiable war machine. And yet, the most painful theft of all was not material. It was the theft of dignity, of freedom, of normalcy. For every Parisian who adjusted their clock forward to Berlin time, for every shopkeeper who watched his shelves emptied for German soldiers, there was a gnawing awareness France was no longer in control of its own destiny. The humiliation was not abstract, it was lived every day. The curfew was enforced with violence. Those caught outside could be shot on sight. A lover who lingered too long at a cafe, a father returning late from work, a student caught sketching graffiti on a wall, all risked their lives. It was tyranny not just on the battlefield, but on the cobblestone streets and in the kitchens of ordinary families. And yet, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city was blacked out and the world seemed to have forgotten them, the people of Paris still dreamed. They dreamed of liberty. They dreamed of the tricolor flag unfurled once more from the Arc de Triomphe. They dreamed of the day when time itself would be theirs again. The Germans had stolen the clocks, but in the hearts of Parisians, the countdown to freedom had already begun. Occupation is rarely just about armies and tanks. It is about the slow reshaping of daily life, the rewriting of rules, so that every step, every word, every breath is under scrutiny. In Paris, once a beacon of liberty, fraternity, and equality, the German authorities moved swiftly to turn the city into a cage. Soon after, the fall orders were posted on walls and announced in the press. They seemed endless, cascading over the people like a tide of paper and ink. Firearms forbidden, radios capable of catching foreign signals forbidden, harboring escaped prisoners of war, a crime punishable by death. Even showing hostility toward German troops, something as small as a glare, a muttered insult, or a refusal to salute could land a man in prison or in front of a firing squad. The curfew, first set from midnight to 6 a.m., was enforced with ruthless efficiency. At the stroke of midnight, Paris did not merely sleep, it suffocated. Street lamps dimmed to near extinction revealed only silhouettes of soldiers pacing back and forth. Anyone found outside without authorization risked arrest, interrogation, or worse. It was as if the city itself had been drafted into silence. But the rules didn't only stifle movement, they targeted the mind. The occupiers understood that control over information meant control over thought. French citizens were ordered to tune their radios only to German-approved stations. No jazz from America. No BBC bulletins crackling through the static with their coded messages to the resistance. Instead, German voices filled the airwaves with carefully crafted propaganda telling the French that their defeat was final, that collaboration with the Reich was the only path to survival, and that resistance was futile. And yet the French spirit, so accustomed to debate and defiance, refused to go quietly. In hidden attics and cellars, radios were smuggled, concealed behind false walls, wrapped in blankets to muffle their sound. Families would huddle together in the dim light of a candle, the dial turned delicately, fingers trembling, as they searched for the faint, forbidden frequency. Ici Londres. Ici Londres. The announcer's words were a lifeline, a whispered promise from across the channel that France was not forgotten. Sometimes the broadcast began with peculiar phrases, nonsense to the occupiers, but coded instructions to the resistance. Jean has a long mustache, the dice are on the carpet. To those in the know, these phrases were a signal, prepare. The sabotage cut, the railway lines, gather the men. Listening was dangerous. German soldiers carried portable detectors that could pick up radio signals. Raids were frequent and punishments were brutal. There were stories of families caught with a radio hidden inside a loaf of bread or behind a false panel in a wardrobe. Sometimes the penalty was deportation to a labor camp. Sometimes it was death. And yet, despite the risk, people kept tuning in. Because silence, they felt, was worse than death. Silence meant surrender. Graffiti became another weapon of the powerless. On the walls of Montmartre, Marais, and Belleville, scrawled in chalk or carved with knives, appeared the Cross of Lorraine, the symbol of free France, and words like Vive de Gaulle, sometimes a crude caricature of Hitler with devil's horns, or the mocking word Boche would appear on a wall by morning. These were not grand acts of sabotage, but they were acts of defiance, and they mattered. They reminded the occupiers that the French spirit could not be completely broken. But the Germans responded with a heavy hand. Posters appeared threatening collective punishment. For every German soldier attacked, 10 French hostages will be shot. The message was clear. The price of resistance would not only be paid by the guilty, but by the innocent. It was a weapon designed to divide the population, to make every citizen fear their neighbor, to make every Frenchman suspicious of every other. And yet, even under this suffocating regime, there were those who chose to resist quietly. Priests smuggled messages through churches, hiding intelligence in hymnals. Railway workers passed secret notes between carriages, slipping instructions into coal piles. Housewives hid rationed food under laundry baskets or in prams, risking everything to feed their families. It was a strange, tense existence. On the surface, Paris appeared calm, even obedient. German officers drank coffee in cafes, attended the opera, admired the Louvre's treasures. The boulevards were tidy, patrolled, orderly. But beneath that order was an invisible war. Every smile could be a mask, every handshake a test. Was your neighbor loyal to France, or did he whisper to the Gestapo at night? The city had become a stage, and everyone was an actor. Parisians learned to hide their hatred behind polite nods, to lower their eyes, to swallow insults. And yet in their hearts, they clung to small acts of rebellion, refusing to speak German, passing bread to a starving neighbor even when it meant less for their own children, painting a tricolor cock on a wall that might be scrubbed away by morning, but would for a few hours remind everyone that France still lived. The occupiers believed they had pacified Paris. They mistook silence for submission. They failed to see that beneath the curfew, the ration cards, the endless posters, and the forced clocks, a quiet storm was gathering. A storm that would one day break in a fury they could not contain. The city was out of time, yes, but history had not finished with Paris. The hourglass had been turned and the sand was still falling. The question was not whether the tide of war would reach the Seine, but when. If the curfew and the shifting of the clock stole the rhythm of daily life, the physical presence of the German army stole its soul. Paris, that jewel of Europe, was suddenly crawling with the gray-green uniforms of the Wehrmacht. Thousands of German soldiers were granted leave to roam the capital, a reward for the brutal victories they had won across the continent. To the occupiers, Paris was no longer a proud capital of resistance and revolution. It was a conquered prize, a stage on which they could parade their dominance. To the Parisians, their beloved boulevards and cafes had been invaded not only by tanks and machine guns, but by a suffocating arrogance. Everywhere, there were boots on cobblestones, boots in the metro stations, boots stomping up stairwells as soldiers barged into apartments under the flimsiest pretexts. The rhythmic crunch of those leather soles became the soundtrack of occupation, a metronome of oppression ticking through every day. The city's most luxurious addresses were claimed by the German elite. The Hotel Ritz, where Hemingway had once sipped cocktails and Coco Chanel had hosted glittering soirees, was transformed into the playground of Nazi officers. Hermann Göring himself strode through its gilded halls, plundering jewels and art with the same hunger he displayed for food and fine wine. The Hotel Meurice, once the haunt of Parisian high society, became the headquarters of the German military command. The Majestic on Avenue Kléber was converted into the Gestapo's Parisian stronghold, where screams behind closed doors became as common as the sound of marching feet. For ordinary Parisians, this was a double humiliation. Not only were they defeated, but their conquerors had taken over the very symbols of French culture and elegance. The salons that once echoed with debates on art, literature, and philosophy now rang with drunken laughter and guttural German. Officers lounged on velvet sofas while ordering crates of Burgundy and champagne, feasting on food confiscated from French markets. To add insult to injury, the armistice fixed the exchange rate between the franc and the Reichsmark at a grotesquely unfair 20-1. Overnight German privates found themselves with the purchasing power of aristocrats. A soldier's modest pay could buy armfuls of pastries, bottles of cognac, or whole legs of ham. They sent packages of delicacies back to their families in Hamburg, Munich, and Berlin, while French families rationed scraps of bread and watered-down soups. Trains leaving the Gare de l'Est or Gare du Nord were piled high with goods destined for Germany: wheels of cheese, barrels of wine, bolts of silk, sacks of wheat. And alongside the food and fabrics, far more irreplaceable treasures disappeared, works of art lifted from museums and private collections. The Nazis established the ERR, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, a unit devoted specifically to the theft of cultural treasures. Paintings by masters like Picasso, Matisse, Van Gogh, and Cézanne vanished. The Nazis were not content with conquest. They sought to rob France of its very soul, its heritage, the symbols of its genius. Some Parisians resisted in their own way. At the Louvre, curators like Jacques Jaujard orchestrated a massive secret evacuation before the Germans even arrived. Masterpieces: Mona Lisa, Venus de Milo Winged, Victory of Samothrace were smuggled out of the city in trucks disguised as Red Cross vehicles and hidden in chateaux scattered across the countryside. For 4 years, curators lived like fugitives, guarding these treasures with their lives, while the Germans looted what remained. Yet the occupation was not only about art and food, it was about human beings. The German authorities claimed the right to requisition housing, displacing families from their own apartments to house soldiers or administrators. A Parisian tailor could return home to find his workshop stripped bare, his sewing machines hauled off to Germany. A family might be ordered to surrender their dining room table for a German officer's quarters left to eat their meals on the floor. The city's theaters and cabarets ironically thrived under occupation. The Germans allowed performances to continue so long as the plays avoided criticism of the Reich and included German-approved themes. Josephine Baker, already an international star, left Paris to work with the resistance abroad, but others remained performing for mixed audiences of Parisians and occupiers. Some saw this as collaboration, others saw it as survival. The line between defiance and compliance blurred in the smoky air of the cabarets. For the young German soldiers, Paris was a dreamscape. For the French, it was a nightmare. To watch their conquerors dance in the same halls where their grandparents had once toasted the Republic was a torment. The German army had not only occupied their city, it had colonized their everyday lives, infiltrated their cafes, their theaters, their parks, and their sense of time itself. One Parisian school teacher later recalled, "We could no longer walk our boulevards as free people. We were extras in a theater where the Germans played the lead roles. They laughed at our cafes, they took our food, they slept in our hotels. And we, the proud people of Paris, were left to stand in line for a loaf of bread." The humiliation was relentless, but it was also sharpening something within the French. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, finding expression in small acts of defiance, mocking graffiti hidden radios, subtle acts of sabotage. The Germans believed they had conquered Paris. In truth, they had only occupied its streets. The heart of the city, stubborn and defiant, was still waiting for its hour. And that hour was approaching faster than anyone could imagine. The thunder rolling across the horizon was not a storm of nature. It was the sound of armies of tanks grinding through the fields of Normandy, of a liberation slowly clawing its way toward the capital. Paris was still shackled in chains. But history has always shown us one thing: chains, no matter how heavy, eventually break. The occupiers did not know it yet, but time, the very time they had tried to steal, was slipping from their grasp. If the clatter of boots and the shadow of swastikas told Parisians who ruled their streets, the gnawing ache in their stomachs reminded them every day of how thoroughly the occupiers intended to starve them into submission. The armistice signed in 1940 was not a peace treaty, it was a contract of exploitation. Article by article, it stripped France of sovereignty and wealth. At its heart lay an economic dagger: the exchange rate. By decree of the Reich, 1 German Reichsmark was to be worth 20 French francs. This single figure altered daily life more than tanks ever could. Overnight, German soldiers became rich men in a poor land. A German private who back home in Hamburg might have struggled to buy a decent supper could now walk into a Parisian patisserie and purchase baskets of pastries, bottles of Burgundy, wheels of brie, all for pocket change. To the German garrison, Paris was a buffet. To the Parisians, it was theft disguised as arithmetic. Worse still, the plunder was not limited to what soldiers could fit in their rucksacks. German requisitioning officers combed through shops, farms, and warehouses. Entire shipments of meat, milk, eggs, and butter were seized before they reached French tables. Locomotives stood in the stations loaded not with passengers, but with cargo barrels of wine, stacks of textiles, crates of chocolate, even livestock bound for Berlin. Parisians joked bitterly that the only thing leaving Paris on time were trains heading east, heavy with their country's lifeblood. The theft extended into the very heart of French culture. The Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the Nazi unit, tasked with looting art, turned Paris into its private hunting ground. They scoured the Louvre, the Jeu de Paume, and the elegant hotels particuliers of Jewish collectors. Masterpieces by Picasso, Cézanne, Matisse, Renoir, and Van Gogh disappeared into crates, some destined for Hitler's planned Führer Museum in Linz, others diverted to the private collections of Göring and other Nazi elites. Hermann Göring himself strutted through the galleries of the Jeu de Paume like a medieval warlord pointing to a Rembrandt, here a Van Dyck there. French curators watched helplessly as centuries of heritage were carted away. Jacques Jaujard, the deputy director of the Louvre, risked everything to save what he could. In secret, under the noses of the occupiers, he organized the evacuation of thousands of artworks before the Germans arrived in Paris. Masterpieces like the Mona Lisa, the Venus de Milo, and the Winged Victory of Samothrace were hidden in remote chateaux guarded by museum staff who lived like fugitives ready to sacrifice their lives for culture itself. But not all treasures could be hidden. By 1943, Nazi convoys carried art jewelry and archives across the border daily. In the Place Vendôme, French citizens watched helplessly as German trucks pulled away from luxury boutiques stacked with loot destined for German salons. The occupiers did not simply want to defeat France, they wanted to erase its grandeur, to strip it bare until nothing remained but a shadow. The economic vice tightened further with rationing. From 1940 onward, every French man, woman, and child was issued a small cardboard ration card. These were divided into categories A, B, C depending on age, gender, and occupation. The allocations were meager and they grew worse with each passing year. By 1941, the average adult's caloric intake had fallen from roughly 400 calories per day to as little as 200. Children were often allotted even less. To put it plainly, Parisians were asked to survive on half the food they needed to live. Bread was dark, dense, and stretched with fillers like chestnut flour or even powdered sawdust. Butter was replaced with thin smears of margarine. Coffee was a cruel joke brewed from roasted acorns or chicory root, bitter and unsatisfying. Meat was almost non-existent for civilians. Families queued for hours to receive a few ounces of horse meat or watery sausages made from scraps. Milk, once a daily staple for children, became a luxury. Malnutrition spread. Tuberculosis, rickets, and anemia became rampant. Children fainted in classrooms. Elderly citizens collapsed in food lines. Parisians were proud of their cuisine, of the artistry of French food, but now meals were an exercise in desperation. Housewives learned to make soup from nettles and dandelions to stretch a few potatoes into a week's worth of sustenance. Black bread was hoarded like gold. A single egg could be worth days of bartering. Meanwhile, the German soldiers feasted. Their barracks were stocked with French meat and butter. Officers dined in commandeered restaurants, eating 5-course meals, while French families tightened their belts another notch. The contrast was unbearable. Every bite a soldier took was a reminder that the occupiers lived like kings on stolen French bread. And when resentment grew, the Germans tightened the leash. Posters went up on the walls. Theft of German property will be punished by death. Farmers who tried to hide a pig or a sack of grain were dragged before military tribunals, fined, or deported. Entire villages were punished if even one man was suspected of smuggling. But hunger makes rebels of the meek. Out of desperation, the black market flourished. In the shadows of Paris, transactions took place in whispers and handshakes. A farmer might ride into the city under cover of darkness with a basket of butter hidden beneath hay. Housewives cycled for miles into the countryside, trading jewelry linens or family heirlooms for a few kilos of flour. A pair of stockings, once a simple item, could fetch astronomical prices. In these hidden markets, the French rediscovered a different kind of community. Neighbors shared tips, which butcher could be bribed, which baker saved a little extra bread for friends, which farmer might trade milk for soap. It was dangerous if caught. Punishments were severe, but it was also a quiet rebellion. Every black market exchange was an act of survival, a refusal to starve quietly under German rule. The Germans may have controlled the official economy, but they could not fully control the human spirit's ingenuity. And in every loaf of bread traded behind closed doors, in every secret shipment of food smuggled into Paris, there was an unspoken message: we will not vanish. We will not die quietly. France will endure. This economic war was brutal. It transformed Paris from a city of cafes and markets into a place of endless queues and empty shelves. But more importantly, it revealed something the Germans could not understand. Scarcity may weaken bodies, but it can also harden resolve. Hunger gnawed at the French stomach, but defiance fed their souls. The Nazis had hoped to pacify Paris by controlling its food, its goods, its time. Instead, they awakened a new determination, a sense that survival itself had become resistance. And as the artillery thunder grew louder from the west, the French began to wonder, perhaps the famine and the fear would not last forever. Perhaps just beyond the horizon, freedom was already marching toward them. If hunger was the slow poison, curfew was the whip. Every evening, as the church bells tolled and the last notes of twilight died behind the slate rooftops, the city seemed to shrink in on itself. At first, when the occupation began, Parisians were told to remain indoors from midnight until 6 in the morning. It was humiliating but manageable. Yet as the years passed and whispers of resistance grew louder, the Germans tightened the screws. Midnight became 11, then 10, then 9. By the height of the war, many Parisians joked bitterly that their city had become a village extinguished before night had even properly fallen. But there was nothing funny about the consequences of breaking curfew. If a man lingered in the street after hours, perhaps visiting a friend or walking home from work, he risked being stopped by a German patrol. Soldiers carried not only rifles, but an invisible authority, the power to decide in that moment whether he would live or die. A missing paper, a misplaced word, even a nervous glance could end in arrest. Some were dragged into trucks and disappeared into prisons like Fresnes, or into the bowels of the Gestapo headquarters at the Hotel Majestic. Others never made it that far. More than one Parisian body was found slumped against a wall at dawn, a bullet in the head, a sheet of paper pinned to the chest shot for violating curfew. In cafes, the fear seeped like smoke. Neighbors who once debated politics loudly now spoke in whispers, or not at all. Who among them might be an informant for the Germans who might report a careless word to the milice, the French collaborators who patrolled alongside the occupiers? Suspicion became a daily companion. In many apartment buildings, tenants would close their doors tightly against one another, not daring to share bread, wine, or news. Paris, once a city of salons and shared laughter, had become a city of closed shutters and cautious silences. The curfew was not only about control of movement, it was about breaking the spirit. Night had always belonged to Paris. The city was famous for it, its boulevards glowing with gaslight, its cafes alive with jazz, its poets scribbling lines by candlelight, its lovers walking along the Seine. The Germans understood this. To banish Parisians from their own nights was to rob them of a piece of their soul. It was a calculated act of domination, an unspoken reminder your city now dances to our tune. But in the shadows, resistance found new soil to grow. What better cover for secret meetings than a city plunged into darkness? The very curfew meant to crush them also gave the resistance its hiding place. In basements and the back rooms of bakeries and candlelit attics, young men and women gathered to whisper plans. They plotted railway sabotage, printed clandestine newspapers, and drafted manifestos calling for unity. Each meeting was an act of defiance, each leaflet dropped into a letterbox, a strike against silence. The danger was ever present. The Gestapo, aided by collaborators, listened for any sign of dissent. If graffiti appeared overnight, Vive de Gaulle scrawled across a wall, German troops would respond by rounding up hostages at dawn. Innocent men were lined up against walls and shot as warnings. In rural villages, the punishment was even harsher. Entire communities could be burned to the ground in reprisal for the actions of a single partisan. Yet paradoxically, this brutality hardened the will of many Parisians. Each new decree, each curfew, each shooting reminded them that survival alone was not enough. To live under such conditions was to die slowly. To resist was dangerous, but it was life in the truest sense of the word. The writer Jean Guéhenno, keeping a secret diary during the occupation, wrote, "We are all prisoners now, but a prisoner who dreams of freedom is freer than his jailer." At the same time, there were those who sought survival in another way, through compliance. Some Parisian cafe owners smiled broadly when German officers walked in hoping for business. Others courted favor, offering their daughters or their best bottles in exchange for protection. Collaboration for them was not ideology, but necessity, or so they told themselves. But to their fellow citizens, such gestures felt like betrayal. This moral gray zone widened as curfews tightened. The pressure cooker of occupation forced every man and woman to choose, resist in secret, comply in silence, or gamble with their lives. And yet every day, the distant artillery grew louder. The people of Paris began to sense something stirring, a whisper on the wind that the cage around their city might not hold forever. The occupiers believed they had silenced Paris. They did not hear the secret heartbeat pulsing beneath the quiet streets. They did not see the eyes that still glowed with defiance behind shuttered windows. They mistook obedience for loyalty, submission for surrender. But history has always punished such blindness. The clock had been forced forward, the night stolen, the people beaten down by fear. But every stolen hour, every silenced voice, every shutter drawn tight was a reminder that time was not theirs to keep. And when the thunder of guns rolled ever nearer from the west, Parisians began to look at their clocks not as shackles, but as countdowns. Midnight was no longer the end of freedom. It was the beginning of its return. If fear stalked the streets of Paris at night, hunger gnawed at its people by day. It was not a sudden pang, but a steady, dull ache, one that stretched across the years of occupation like an unbroken chain. Hunger is a quiet tyrant. It saps strength, clouds judgment, and gnaws away at dignity. It was, in many ways, the most effective weapon the occupiers wielded. By 1941, rationing had already become the rhythm of life. Every citizen was issued a set of ration cards, small, flimsy rectangles of cardboard that determined what they could eat and how much. Each card was stamped with letters A, B, C, or E, depending on age, sex, and occupation. Children received fewer rations than manual laborers. The elderly, often the least able to fend for themselves, were given the least. On paper, the allotment seemed just barely survivable. An adult was rationed between 1,200 and 1,500 calories per day, half the recommended intake for survival, let alone for work. By contrast, German citizens back in Berlin, despite the Allied blockade, received around 2,000 calories daily. And the German soldiers stationed in France ate better than anyone: fresh meat, butter, eggs, chocolate, and wine taken from French farms and markets. Bread. Once the heartbeat of French cuisine was now a pale shadow of itself. The loaves that came from bakeries were dark and heavy, made with a mixture of flour bran and ground chestnuts. Sometimes even sawdust found its way into the dough, stretching meager supplies. The crust was hard, the taste bitter, but still, people lined up for hours in the cold and rain, clutching their ration cards, hoping there would be something left when their turn came. Butter became a memory. In its place came margarine, watery, tasteless, often rancid. Coffee, that cherished morning ritual of every Parisian cafe, vanished. In its stead, ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, chicory, or barley, so foul-tasting that even the most desperate joked it was coffee for the enemy. Sugar was rationed to a few lumps per week. Chocolate was rarer than gold. The lack of protein was devastating. Meat was rationed to mere grams per week, sometimes no more than a thin slice of horse meat, stringy and gray. Eggs were almost unobtainable, and milk was reserved for infants and the sick, though even then it was often watered down. Malnutrition spread rapidly. Children's growth was stunted. Hospitals reported soaring cases of rickets and tuberculosis. In classrooms, teachers watched in anguish as pupils fainted from hunger. The French government tried to present rationing as a patriotic duty, a noble sacrifice for the survival of the nation. Posters depicted smiling families around meager meal slogans, urging citizens to be brave and frugal. But reality was harsher. In poorer districts of Paris, mothers boiled nettles, turnip greens, or even dandelion leaves into thin soups. In the countryside, families gnawed on black market bacon or horse bones simmered for broth. And yet the indignity was not evenly shared. German soldiers strutted into butcher shops and bakeries, their pockets bulging with Reichsmarks, and left with armfuls of food. In the black markets that sprang up in the shadows, those with money could still find buttermeat, even wine. But the prices were astronomical, sometimes 30 times the official ration cost. A single chicken could cost an entire month's wages. Farmers pressured to hand over their harvest to German requisition officers often faced impossible choices. If they complied fully, their families and neighbors starved. If they withheld even a portion, they risked heavy fines, imprisonment, or deportation. Some farmers became reluctant smugglers, hiding sacks of flour in false wagon floors, or driving into the city with a cow disguised as if it were sick, only to butcher it in a hidden cellar. In Paris itself, ingenuity became the key to survival. Housewives learned to stretch ingredients to impossible lengths. A single onion might flavor soup for an entire family for a week. Old shoes were boiled for the leather, creating a broth that at least tricked the stomach into thinking it had eaten. In the Marais, children were sent to the countryside with bicycles carrying backpacks stuffed with linens or jewelry to barter for food. And always the black market flourished. At dawn in shadowed alleys, people gathered to exchange what they had. A gold ring for a sack of potatoes, a bottle of perfume for a slab of bacon, a painting from a grandmother's parlor for a few tins of sardines. Some grew rich on this underground economy, hoarding goods and selling them for outrageous sums. Others despised them, calling them profiteurs de guerre, war profiteers, scavengers feeding on their neighbors' hunger. Yet even those who cursed them sometimes bought from them because to starve quietly was not an option. This hunger was not confined to food. It seeped into every aspect of life. It was a hunger for freedom, for dignity, for the return of sons and husbands imprisoned in Germany. Nearly 2 million French soldiers had been captured during the Blitzkrieg and sent to labor camps. Families were torn apart, fathers absent for years, mothers raised children alone, ration cards clutched in trembling hands waiting for letters that might never come. The hunger then was not only in the belly, it was in the heart. It was the emptiness of chairs left permanently vacant at the dinner table, the silence of streets once filled with music and laughter, the ache of longing for a France that seemed to have been stolen overnight. And yet, hunger has a paradoxical power. It weakens the body, but it also sharpens the will. A starving child's cry could break a mother's heart, but it could also harden her resolve never to forgive the occupiers who had forced her child to go hungry. The Germans had intended rationing to sap French strength to make resistance impossible. Instead, it created a different kind of resistance. To smuggle a loaf of bread into Paris was to strike a blow against tyranny. To share a handful of beans with a neighbor was an act of defiance. To refuse to smile at a German officer while one's stomach roared with emptiness was itself a declaration: you may control our food, but you will never control our souls. By 1942 and 1943, the hunger was no longer just a weapon of war. It had become the very landscape of French life. Gaunt faces stared back from mirrors. Children's shoes went unreplaced, patched and patched again, until the soles fell apart. The Seine carried not only reflections, but the smell of sewage, for the city could not maintain its infrastructure under the constant drain of resources. In the countryside, desperation bred quiet rebellion. Farmers formed secret barter networks, trading flour for wine eggs, for firewood meat, for soap. In the hills of Auvergne and the scrublands of Corsica, young men fled into the wilderness rather than submit to forced labor in Germany. These groups would soon coalesce into something more organized, something far more dangerous to the occupiers. But that story belonged to the future. For now, in the winter of 1941 and 1942, Paris remained trapped in the shadow of hunger. The city's soul was tested daily, not in battles with guns, but in the struggle to find bread to keep children alive, to endure another day under a foreign clock and a foreign flag. Yet the people endured. For all the suffering, for all the starvation, Paris did not collapse. And in their endurance, the Parisians found a strange kind of strength, a strength that would one day fuel the fires of liberation. When ration cards became little more than scraps of paper promising what could not be delivered, the French turned elsewhere. In the dim corridors of Parisian apartment blocks, in the back alleys, behind shuttered bistros, in the shadows beneath railway bridges, a parallel world came alive. The marché noir, the black market. The official economy, bound in German decrees and strangled by requisitions, was starving the people. But hunger, like water, always finds a crack to flow through. Farmers who had once brought their produce proudly to the markets now concealed it under hay bales and false floors of wagons, or inside barrels of manure to avoid German patrols. At night, bicycles creaked along darkened country lanes as women pedaled miles to barter jewelry linens or family heirlooms for a dozen eggs or a kilogram of butter. In Paris, those goods found their way to hidden stalls and back rooms. A butcher might slide a thin cut of beef under the counter to a trusted customer, provided she could pay not with ration tickets but with cash, or better yet, gold coins, cigarettes, or bottles of fine wine. A single bar of chocolate could cost 30 times its pre-war price, yet people paid without hesitation if it meant seeing their child smile again, if only for one sweet moment. The Germans knew of the black market, of course. They threatened heavy fines, imprisonment, even deportation for those caught trading outside official channels. They raided farms, seizing hidden livestock. They patrolled the train stations, searching bags and bicycle baskets for contraband food. But for every cart of potatoes they seized, another found its way through. The hunger was too great, the need too urgent. For some, the black market became a way to survive. For others, it was a way to profit. Certain dealers grew wealthy, hoarding goods to sell at exorbitant prices. They became known as profiteurs, de guerre war profiteers despised by their neighbors, but often untouchable thanks to connections with German officers or the Vichy police. It was a moral labyrinth who was a criminal and who was simply feeding their children. The black market also became a channel for the resistance. Hidden among the trades of butter wine and tobacco were whispers of weapons and explosives. Resistance fighters relied on farmers and smugglers to move not only food, but arms, radios, and forged documents. A farmer handing over a sack of potatoes might slip a note inside a warning of a German patrol, a message from London, or a call to sabotage a railway line. This underground economy blurred the lines between survival and rebellion. To buy a loaf of bread on the black market might seem like a simple act of desperation, but it was also in its own way a defiance of German control. Every franc spent outside the official system weakened the occupiers' grip on France's lifeline. Every clandestine trade was a tiny fracture in the wall of tyranny. And yet, the hunger remained. Malnutrition became an invisible plague. Parisian hospitals filled with patients suffering from anemia, tuberculosis, and vitamin deficiencies. Children's bones grew soft from lack of calcium. Pregnant women miscarried at alarming rates. Some people collapsed in the interminable queues outside bakeries, fainting from hunger before they reached the counter. In working-class neighborhoods, people dug up weeds from cracks in the pavement to boil into bitter stews. In apartments stripped of heating fuel, families huddled together under threadbare blankets, gnawing on crusts of black bread that tasted of dust and bark. The famed Parisian cafes, once symbols of sophistication, were reduced to serving watery turnip soup and ersatz coffee. Even these meager offerings were often reserved for German soldiers and collaborators. The humiliation was constant. To watch a German private barely out of adolescence eat steak and drink Bordeaux while your child chewed stale crusts was almost unbearable. In the markets, German soldiers laughed as they bought crates of cheese and wine, often shipping them home to their families. The sight became a bitter reminder. Not only was Paris occupied, it was being drained day by day of its sustenance and spirit. Still, amid the despair, there were sparks of resilience. Mothers learned to make desserts from carrots and beets, coloring them with whatever they could find. Families rediscovered old recipes for soups made of potato peels, turnip greens, and chestnuts. Hunger became a teacher, forcing ingenuity but also a unifying bond. Sharing food, no matter how little, was a way of saying we are still human, we are still French. Letters smuggled from German labor camps revealed the same story from the other side. Prisoners of war wrote home begging for packages of bread, sugar, and tobacco. Families already starving themselves scraped together whatever they could to send across the border. The act of mailing a parcel was both love and rebellion, a way of saying we will not let them starve you, even if it means we go hungry. The black market was both salvation and betrayal, resistance and collaboration. In the shadow of hunger, morality blurred. Some turned against their neighbors for a scrap of food. Others risked everything to keep those neighbors alive. It was a mirror held up to the soul of France, and what it reflected was both shame and greatness. By 1943, the situation had become unbearable. The hunger was not easing, it was worsening. Supplies that once included at least occasional luxuries, wine, cheese, chocolate, were now gone. The Germans were no longer content with luxuries. They demanded essentials: meat, metal, textiles, leather, even soap. The occupation had moved from plunder to strangulation. And yet, if hunger weakened bodies, it did something else to the French spirit. It taught them that survival itself could be an act of defiance. To endure, to refuse to collapse, to feed one another in secret, these were not small things. They were victories. Every crust of bread shared, every drop of milk smuggled, every ration card forged was a declaration. We will not die on our knees. We will not vanish. We are still here. Paris lived on gaunt and exhausted, but unbroken. The occupiers had stolen time, food, art, and dignity. But they could not steal hope. And as the rumble of artillery from the west grew louder each night, Parisians began to believe that their hunger would not last forever. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the tide of war was turning. If hunger gnawed at the body, exile hollowed out the heart. By the end of 1940, France was no longer just a nation under occupation. It was a nation scattered, divided, and uprooted. Nearly 2 million French soldiers had been captured during the Blitzkrieg and shipped off to prisoner of war camps in Germany. These men became pawns in Hitler's cruel arithmetic. Their absence ripped holes in the fabric of French society. Town squares, once filled with fathers, brothers, and sons, stood eerily silent. Workshops closed for lack of skilled hands. Farms that had relied on young men to till the soil were left to their elderly parents and their wives. In countless homes, a chair sat permanently empty at the dinner table. Children grew up without fathers, sometimes not even remembering their faces, except from fading photographs tucked inside books or hidden in drawers. Letters arrived sporadically from stalags and oflags, POW camps scattered across the Reich. They were censored, brief, and often filled with forced optimism. We are well fed, we are treated fairly. Yet between the lines, wives and mothers could read the truth. Hunger, cold, exhaustion, despair. The Germans made no secret of their policy. In the Armistice Agreement, a cruel clause declared that Germany was under no obligation to release the captured soldiers. They were, in essence, hostages. Their freedom dangled as a bargaining chip. And the message was clear: if the French people wanted their fathers and brothers back, they would have to cooperate. This policy tore families apart in ways no bomb could. Imagine a mother in Lyon, her husband locked in a camp hundreds of kilometers away, raising 3 children on half rations. Each day she lined up for bread, each night she mended worn shoes by candlelight. Her eldest son, 16, looked more like a boy of 12, his growth stunted by malnutrition. Her daughter asked the same question every evening: when is Papa coming home? She had no answer. The absence of these men also reshaped entire communities. Villages became ghostly populated by women, children, and the elderly. In some towns, the silence was so profound that neighbors could hear each other's doors open and close from down the street. In Paris, the city that once brimmed with over 3 million residents saw its population shrink to fewer than 800,000 during the occupation. Many had fled south during the Great Exode of 1940, never to return. The exode was chaos incarnate. When the German tanks broke through the French lines in May 1940, panic rippled through the population. Families packed whatever they could carry: mattresses tied to car roofs, chickens stuffed into baskets, children clutching dolls and loaves of bread. The highways clogged with bicycles, carts, and terrified pedestrians. Those who moved too slowly were strafed by German aircraft, the roar of engines followed by the scream of diving Stukas. Survivors recalled the roads littered with abandoned suitcases, overturned wagons, and bodies covered hastily with blankets. For those who stayed behind in Paris, exile was not physical but spiritual. Their city was no longer their own. They were foreigners in their own streets. The German language filled the air. German flags draped their monuments. German officers occupied their hotels. Even the city's rhythm had been altered, its clocks forcibly aligned with Berlin. It was as though an iron curtain had fallen overnight, cutting them off from their past, their traditions, their pride. And yet in this climate of absence and humiliation, the French people searched for ways to resist. They clung to their identity in small gestures, singing La Marseillaise in hushed voices, teaching children the stories of Joan of Arc and Napoleon, reminding themselves that France had survived defeats before and had always risen again. The memory of 1871 of 1918 lived on. Defeat was never final unless one surrendered inwardly. Still, the Germans tightened their grip. With so many French men held captive, Hitler and his ministers saw an opportunity. The Reich needed labor desperately. German factories were starved of workers as millions of able-bodied men fought and died on the Eastern Front. France, with its industrial capacity and its captive population, seemed the perfect reservoir. At first, the occupiers tried persuasion. Posters plastered on Parisian walls depicted smiling Frenchmen working in German factories, their faces healthy, their hands steady. The captions promised good wages, warm meals, and the noble satisfaction of helping to support comrades languishing in German camps. This was the so-called relive, the relief shift announced in 1942. The offer was stark. For every 3 French workers who volunteered to work in Germany, 1 French prisoner of war would be released. To the Vichy government, it was a compromise worth celebrating. They trumpeted it as a triumph of negotiation, a sign that they were protecting French families by reuniting them with their sons and husbands. Propaganda posters called it an act of patriotism, a selfless sacrifice. To leave your family and toil in German factories was framed as noble, as if the laborer were a soldier in a different kind of battle. But the reality was far darker. The French people could see through the charade. For every prisoner released, 3 new lives were uprooted, 3 new families were broken. The Germans were not negotiating. They were extorting, trading one kind of suffering for another. The relief was an illusion, a cruel barter in which France always lost. Still, desperation drove choices. By the end of 1942, nearly 250,000 French workers had been sent to Germany under the Relive program. Many went reluctantly, pressured by Vichy propaganda, lured by promises of better food, or driven by guilt over imprisoned loved ones. Others resisted, hiding in the countryside, aided by sympathetic farmers who risked their own lives to shelter them. For those who did go, the reality was brutal. They were herded into trains and transported east, not to the comfortable lodgings promised in posters, but to barracks and factories, where conditions were scarcely better than those endured by prisoners of war. They worked long hours in steel mills, mines, and munitions plants, producing the very weapons used to kill their compatriots. Food was meager, punishment harsh, and any sign of defiance could lead to imprisonment or execution. In Paris, families watched their sons depart with heavy hearts. Mothers pressed small tokens into their hands, across a lock of hair, a photograph. Fathers, if they were still home, gave stern advice. Remember, you are French. Do not let them take that from you. Many of these young men would never return. Exile then was not just the absence of bodies. It was the slow unraveling of the ties that bound families and communities together. It was the sound of silence in the evening, when the men who once sang in cafes or argued politics on the street were gone. It was the emptiness of churches, the hollowing out of neighborhoods, the vanishing of laughter from playgrounds. But exile also sowed seeds of resistance. Young men who refused to go to Germany fled into the hills and forests, hiding among the scrublands, the maquis from which they would later take their name. There in the wilderness, far from the eyes of the occupiers, they began to organize. With rifles smuggled from Spain, with explosives dropped by parachute from British planes, they trained for the day when France would rise again. The Germans believed they had caged France, divided it into obedient halves, the occupied north and the puppet-controlled Vichy south. They believed hunger and exile would break the nation's back. But in reality, each ration card, each requisition order, each forced labor decree was a spark striking against the stone of French pride. Slowly, painfully, a fire was catching. And on those long, hungry nights in Paris, when mothers rocked their children to sleep with empty stomachs and fathers' chairs sat vacant at the table that fire smoldered, the people endured, they dreamed. And in their dreams, the city was whole again, lit not by the pale light of Berlin's stolen hours, but by the brilliance of its own reborn dawn. When the Nazis realized that hunger alone could not break the will of the French, they reached for another weapon: words. If bread was scarce, propaganda was endless. The walls of Paris, once adorned with posters for operas, films, and political rallies, were now plastered with bold, brightly colored images, painted to look cheerful but dripping with menace beneath the surface. One poster showed smiling French workers boarding a train, waving as though leaving for a holiday. The slogan read, "Ils partent travailler en Allemagne pour que leurs camarades reviennent." They go to work in Germany so their comrades can return. Another depicted muscular young men in overall sleeves, rolled high, laboring under the watchful gaze of the Reich's eagle, as if factory work in Stuttgart or Essen were a patriotic duty equal to fighting at Verdun. This was the relive, the relief shift announced in the spring of 1942. Its promise was cruelly simple: for every 3 French workers who volunteered to toil in German factories, 1 French prisoner of war would be released. To Marshal Pétain's government in Vichy, it was a diplomatic triumph, proof that collaboration could shield French families from suffering. They called it a noble compromise. But to the average Parisian, the relive was a trap. It forced impossible choices upon already broken families. Imagine a woman whose husband languishes in a camp in Saxony. She is told that if 3 young men from her village volunteer to work in Germany, her husband might come home. The village gathers, the air thick with guilt and unspoken calculations. Who will go? Will the unmarried boys be sent in place of fathers? What price does one put on a man's return? By the end of 1942, around 250,000 French workers had left for Germany under this program. Some went reluctantly, believing Pétain's promises, hoping their sacrifice would reunite families. Others went because they were desperate, because a German recruiter promised better rations, warmer clothing, and wages to send home. But the reality was very different. Those who boarded these trains found themselves herded into barracks assigned to endless shifts in munitions factories or coal mines. They worked 12 to 14 hours a day, often in freezing conditions, their meals scarcely better than those of prisoners. They were watched by guards, threatened with punishment, and in many cases, treated little better than the POWs they were supposed to be replacing. The promised wages evaporated into deductions for food, lodging, and expenses. Back home, the propaganda machine continued to churn. Newspapers like Le Matin and Je suis partout praised the workers as heroes, saviors of France's imprisoned sons. Vichy officials staged ceremonies where the few returning POWs, emaciated, broken men, were paraded as proof of the program's success. But everyone could see the truth. For every man returned, 3 had been stolen away. The arithmetic was clear. France was being drained of its lifeblood. The propaganda grew more desperate as fewer men volunteered. Posters with cheerful slogans gave way to more menacing imagery, warnings of penalties for refusing to serve, threats of losing ration cards, whispers of forced conscription. By 1943, Hitler had grown impatient. He appointed Fritz Sauckel, a fanatical Nazi loyalist, as general plenipotentiary for labor deployment. Sauckel was blunt, with none of the false courtesy that had colored earlier propaganda. He did not promise, he demanded. He became known as the Slaver of Europe. Under Sauckel's orders, the Vichy government introduced the Service du Travail Obligatoire, the compulsory work service, in February 1943. No longer would young men be asked to volunteer. Now all males between 18 and 50 and all unmarried women between 21 and 35 could be forced into labor for the Reich. They were summoned by official letters, often delivered with chilling formality. The Vichy regime tried to spin even this as patriotic. Posters declared travail en Allemagne equals travail pour la France, work in Germany equals work for France. But the facade had cracked. Everyone knew what it meant. It was slavery, pure and simple. The introduction of the STO was a breaking point. For 3 years, Parisians had endured humiliation, silence, hunger, and theft. They had borne the absence of their menfolk, the endless queues for food, the sting of the curfew. But now to see their young men, sons, brothers, neighbors ordered to leave their homeland and labor for the enemy was too much. Many refused. Instead of reporting to recruitment offices, they vanished. They disappeared into the countryside, into the forests and mountains, into the scrublands of Corsica and the wilds of the massive Central. There, among the thorn and bramble, they formed the Maquis bands of guerrilla fighters named after the rough, untamed terrain where they hid. The German occupiers had hoped their propaganda would inspire loyalty. Instead, it inspired rebellion. The very posters that declared working in Germany was patriotic became symbols of deceit. They were defaced, mocked, torn down. Across Paris, graffiti artists scrawled the Cross of Lorraine, the emblem of free France, across the faces of smiling workers in Nazi posters. Sometimes they drew mustaches and horns on Hitler's portrait. And beyond the city walls and the darkness of the forests, the young men of the Maquis were preparing. They had no uniforms, no resources, and few weapons, but they had something stronger, a hunger not just for food, but for freedom. They practiced sabotage, derailing trains, cutting telephone lines, blowing up bridges. They trained with rifles smuggled across the Pyrenees from Spain or dropped in secret by British planes. They learned to fight like shadows, striking, disappearing, striking again. The French people had reached their breaking point. The occupiers had overplayed their hand. In trying to squeeze every ounce of labor and every crumb of food from France, they had ignited the very rebellion they sought to prevent. And yet, for all their suffering, the Parisians carried themselves with quiet dignity. In the words of one resistance fighter, they told us to work for Germany. We chose instead to fight for France. The storm was gathering and the hourglass of Berlin's time was nearly empty. By 1943, the mask of civility had slipped away. What had begun as the illusion of compromise, the relive, with its promise of bringing prisoners home, had revealed itself for what it truly was, the opening act of forced labor. The German war machine, bleeding itself dry on the Eastern Front, demanded ever more bodies to feed its factories, mines, and railways. When persuasion failed, coercion became the rule. Adolf Hitler placed this grim responsibility into the hands of one man, Fritz Sauckel, a fervent Nazi who spoke without subtlety. Sauckel was appointed General Bevelmächtigter für den Arbeitseinsatz, General Plenipotentiary for labor deployment. His task was blunt: deliver millions of foreign workers to Germany by any means necessary. Even his fellow Nazis nicknamed him Der Sklavenhalter Europas, the slaver of Europe. Sauckel wasted no time. With the cooperation of the Vichy government, he transformed the voluntary relève into the Service du Travail Obligatoire, STO, the compulsory work service. No longer would the occupiers wait for volunteers. Beginning in February 1943, every French male between the ages of 18 and 50 and every unmarried woman between 21 and 35 could be summoned to labor for the Reich. The letters were delivered with bureaucratic precision, stamped with official seals. There was no mistaking their meeting report to the station or face arrest. The Vichy propaganda machine attempted once again to sugarcoat the decree. Posters proclaimed "Partir travailler, en Allemagne c'est servir la France." To go to Germany, they said, was not betrayal, but duty. Leaflets depicted clean, smiling French workers side by side with Germans producing planes and tanks that would supposedly secure peace for Europe. The message was clear: to resist was selfish, to obey was patriotic. But the French had learned to read between the lines. They knew what awaited those who boarded those trains. Word had filtered back from men already sent east under the relève. The promised warm meals were thin soups and crusts of bread. The wages were pitiful, eaten up by deductions for lodging and food. The factories were cold, the shifts unending, the overseers brutal. The volunteers worked under the same conditions as prisoners of war, shoulder to shoulder with Russians, Poles, and Ukrainians dragged from their homelands. And so, when the STO orders began to arrive in Paris, thousands of young men made a choice. They would not go. They would not feed the German machine that was devouring their brothers on the front lines. Instead, they disappeared. Some fled to the countryside, hiding in barns or caves. Others took to the forests and mountains, joining the bands of resistors, who called themselves the Maquis. The name came from the scrubby underbrush of Corsica, a landscape of thickets and rocks that offered cover to outlaws and fugitives. In those wild hills, men and women who refused the STO began to train as guerrilla fighters. Life in the Maquis was harsh. Food was scarce, winters were brutal, and weapons were few. Many of the young fighters had never fired a gun before. They scavenged old rifles from the First World War, raided German convoys for ammunition, and waited for Allied parachute drops to deliver explosives and radios. Yet what they lacked in resources, they made up for in spirit. They knew that to remain in Paris under the STO was to live as a slave. To escape into the Maquis was to reclaim at least a fragment of freedom. The Germans, enraged by this defiance, responded with increasing violence. Raids became more frequent. The Gestapo, working with the French milice, hunted down deserters and resistors. When they caught one, they made examples of them: executions in public squares, deportations to camps, families punished for the actions of their sons. And yet, the more they struck, the stronger the resistance became. Each new raid drove more young men into the forests. Each act of brutality turned more citizens against the occupiers. Paris, once silent, began to murmur with quiet defiance. The black market, already thriving now, became a lifeline for the resistance. Smugglers who once carried butter and eggs into Paris now carried ammunition and radio parts into the hills. Women who bartered linens for food also passed messages concealed in baskets or tucked beneath babies' blankets. Priests whispered encouragement from pulpits even as they risked arrest. The STO had been meant to weaken France, to strip it of its youth, and deliver them into German hands. Instead, it gave birth to a movement that would one day help bring the Reich to its knees. The turning point had come. The occupiers did not realize it yet, but the more they demanded, the less they would receive. They had stolen France's time, its food, its art, its dignity. Now they sought to steal its sons and daughters. And in doing so, they had awakened something they could not control: a spirit that refused to be enslaved. The French people had endured hunger. They had endured curfews. They had endured the humiliation of German boots on their boulevards and swastikas on their monuments. But the demand for their children, this was the line that could not be crossed. The fire smoldering in the hearts of Parisians now burst into flame. The city was no longer just waiting for liberation. It was preparing for it. And soon, when the thunder of guns from the west grew into a storm on their doorstep, Paris would rise not as a prisoner, not as a victim, but as a fighter. The occupiers had built their empire on forced labor, on stolen bread, on fear. But every empire built on chains forgets the most important truth: a people who have nothing left to lose cannot be broken. The spring of 1943 marked a shift. For years, the French people had endured bending under the weight of occupation but not breaking. They had suffered hunger, watched their treasures carted away, lived under curfews that turned their luminous city into a tomb. But the Service du Travail Obligatoire, the forced labor decree, was the final straw. When Sokol's letters arrived in Parisian mailboxes, the reaction was immediate. Young men summoned to report to recruitment offices and prepare for deportation to German factories simply did not show up. They vanished. Some slipped out of the city at dawn, backpacks hastily packed, leaving only hurried notes for their mothers. Others disappeared quietly after curfew, never to return. It was as if an entire generation of Parisian youth had dissolved into the countryside. But they had not vanished. They had gone underground. Across the hills of the Massif Central, in the forests of the Limousin, and in the wild scrublands of Corsica, these men, and sometimes women, were forming groups that came to be known as the Maquis. The name was borrowed from the Maquis shrubland of Corsica, where outlaws had once hidden from authorities. Now in the 1940s, it came to symbolize the rugged independence of those who refused to bow to Hitler's demands. Life in the Maquis was not romantic. The fighters slept in barns, caves, or makeshift huts woven from branches. Food was scarce, and the cold winters bit deep. Weapons were scarce. Too many carried old rifles left over from the First World War, or pistols stolen from inattentive German soldiers. Ammunition was precious, often scavenged from ambushes or parachuted in by the British Special Operations Executive. Yet in these hills, among the young men who had refused to be slaves, a new kind of France was taking shape. They trained as guerrillas, learning to move like shadows. By day, they blended into the forests, foraging for food, carrying messages between villages. By night, they struck. A train carrying German supplies might derail on a mountain pass. A telephone line might suddenly go silent. A bridge might vanish in a roar of dynamite. These were not grand battles, they were pinpricks. But 1,000 pinpricks can bleed an empire. At first, the Germans dismissed them as an annoyance, calling them terrorists or bandits. But annoyance soon turned to fury. German patrols began combing the countryside hunting the Maquis. When they failed to capture the fighters, they turned their rage upon the civilians. Entire villages were punished for the actions of a few. The most infamous of these reprisals came in June 1944 in the small village of Oradour-sur-Glane. After a resistance attack killed a German officer, the SS descended on the town. They gathered the men in barns and machine-gunned them. Women and children were herded into the church, which was then set ablaze. In a single day, 642 civilians were murdered. The village was left in ruins, a silent monument to brutality. To this day, its burned-out houses and charred church remain untouched, a memorial to the cruelty of occupation. These massacres were meant to terrify, to silence, to break the will of the people, but often they had the opposite effect. News of atrocities spread quickly through whispered conversations, through smuggled letters, through clandestine newspapers like Combat and Libération. Every new atrocity hardened the French resolve. The resistance, once a loose network of scattered idealists, now began to grow rapidly. It was not just young men in the forests. Women played a critical role. They served as couriers, carrying secret messages hidden in baskets of bread or sewn into clothing. They sheltered fugitives in attics and cellars. They distributed underground newspapers, often under the noses of German patrols. One young woman, Lucy Aubrac, orchestrated daring escapes for her husband Raymond, a resistance leader, even tricking German officers into releasing him from prison. Students, too, found their voice. At the Sorbonne, clandestine pamphlets circulated denouncing collaboration and urging resistance. In classrooms, professors slipped patriotic references into lectures thinly veiled but understood by their students. Even priests, standing at their pulpits, delivered sermons that carried double meanings, offering spiritual comfort while quietly encouraging defiance. Paris itself became a battlefield of whispers. A cafe waiter might deliberately spill wine on a German officer's uniform. A postman might delay a letter or deliver it to the resistance instead. A tram conductor might slow his vehicle just long enough for a saboteur to leap aboard after planting explosives. Each act was small, almost invisible, but together they formed a web of defiance that stretched across the city. For the occupiers, this was a nightmare. They had assumed that fear, hunger, and propaganda would bend the French to their will. Instead, every decree seemed to backfire. The more they demanded, the less they received. The more they punished, the more enemies they created. And all the while, beyond the western horizon, the thunder of Allied guns grew louder. In Normandy, the beaches would soon be stormed. The resistance, now numbering in the tens of thousands, prepared to play its part. The Maquis were no longer mere fugitives. They were soldiers ready to rise. In the summer of 1944, Paris was a city of shadows. On the surface, the German soldiers still strutted through the boulevards, their boots echoing on the stones. But beneath that surface, in the hidden rooms and the whispered messages in the forests of central France, the true France was gathering its strength. The occupiers could not see it. They believed they had tamed Paris, broken its will. But history is full of rulers who mistook silence for surrender. And when the hour came, the city that had waited in darkness would show the world that its spirit had never been conquered. Defiance in occupied France was not a gesture made lightly. To scrawl a slogan on a wall, to shelter a fugitive, to sabotage a railway line, each act carried a price. And the occupiers were determined to make that price unbearable. From the earliest days of occupation, the Germans had adopted a policy of collective punishment. If a German soldier was killed by the resistance, 10 French hostages could be shot in reprisal. If a train was sabotaged, entire villages might be fined or deported. At first, the reprisals were targeted, arresting relatives of suspected partisans, executing those who resisted interrogation. But by 1943 and 1944, as the resistance grew bolder and the German hold on France began to slip, the reprisals became indiscriminate. The logic was simple and cruel. If the population could not be convinced to obey, it would be terrorized into submission. Stories spread quickly, whispered from neighbor to neighbor, retold in long bread lines and dimly lit apartments in the hushed pews of churches. A boy in Brittany who had hidden a downed Allied pilot was discovered the next day his father was shot. A farmer suspected of feeding the Maquis was executed. His wife and children left destitute. Entire families vanished overnight, dragged into trucks by the Gestapo, their neighbors too afraid to intervene. And then came the massacres. The most infamous of all took place on June 10, 1944, in the quiet village of Oradour-sur-Glane in the Limousin region. That morning, a unit of the SS Das Reich division surrounded the town. The villagers were gathered in the square, men on one side, women and children on the other. The men were herded into barns and machine-gunned. The women and children were locked inside the church, which was then set ablaze. Those who tried to flee were shot. By the end of the day, 642 civilians lay dead, men, women, infants burned alive in the pews where they had prayed. The ruins of Oradour were left untouched after the war, preserved as a monument to the brutality of occupation. Today, one can still walk through its silent streets, see the rusting carcass of a car in the town square, the blackened beams of the church roof. It is as if time stopped on that terrible June day, a frozen scream echoing across generations. But Oradour was not alone. Across France, other villages suffered similar fates, if on smaller scales. In Toul 99, men were hanged from lampposts and balconies in a single day, their bodies left dangling as a warning. In Assique near Lille, 86 men were executed after a railway sabotage. In the Vercors region, entire communities were bombed and burned when the Maquis declared a free republic. The occupiers intended these horrors to crush resistance. Instead, they often had the opposite effect. For every village destroyed, a dozen more vowed revenge. For every family executed, another family took up arms. It was a pattern as old as tyranny itself. The Roman Empire had once crucified thousands of rebels along its roads, believing fear would secure obedience. Instead, it sowed seeds of hatred that never truly died. Napoleon himself had used terror to subdue conquered lands, only to watch resistance smolder long after his armies marched on. Now it was France's turn to feel the lash of empire and to learn that cruelty can silence a people for a time, but it can never extinguish their will to be free. Inside Paris, the cost of defiance was no less severe. The Milice, the French paramilitary police loyal to Vichy, worked hand in glove with the Gestapo. Many of them were not fanatics, but opportunists, men who saw collaboration as a path to better rations, exemption from labor service, or the thrill of power. They prowled the streets, listening for whispers, watching for signs of dissent. Their presence was often more terrifying than the Germans themselves. A neighbor who once shared bread with you could now be the man who betrays you to the Milice for a packet of cigarettes. Torture became routine. At the Hotel Majestic, the Gestapo interrogated suspects with electric shocks, beatings, and psychological torment. Survivors told of hours spent in dark cells, of being forced to listen to the screams of others. Families waited outside for news, often in vain. The door would open, but the man or woman they loved would never emerge. And yet, in the face of this terror, Parisians continued to resist. They were not soldiers, not trained warriors. They were bakers, students, teachers, seamstresses. Their weapons were typewriters, paintbrushes, bicycles, and courage. A young courier might ride through the city with a secret message hidden in the handlebars of her bicycle, knowing that discovery meant death. A printer might set his presses at night, producing leaflets that denounced collaboration and celebrated the Free French. A priest might baptize a child under an assumed name to shield them from deportation. Every act of defiance was a gamble with death, but every act was also a spark, and sparks, when fanned by hunger and hatred, can become fire. By 1944, that fire was spreading fast. The Maquis had grown from a scattered handful into a force of tens of thousands. Paris was no longer just a city under occupation. It was a city simmering with rebellion. German soldiers sensed it. They saw the narrowed eyes in the streets, the quickened pace of pedestrians, the defaced posters on the walls. They responded with more patrols, more arrests, more executions, but their grip was slipping. The cost of defiance was terrible. Lives lost, families destroyed, villages wiped from the map. But the French people had reached a grim conclusion. Submission meant death as surely as resistance did. If one must die, better to die with dignity, to die fighting, to die with the tricolor in one's heart. In the words of a resistance fighter who survived the war, they could take our bread, they could take our brothers, they could take our knights, but they could never take from us the certainty that we would one day be free. The occupiers had thought fear would keep Paris silent forever, but fear, when pressed too far, becomes fuel, and the fire was now burning too brightly to be contained. The storm was drawing closer. Soon the thunder heard at night would no longer be distant. Soon it would roll into the very heart of the city. If hunger was the shadow over Paris and curfews the iron bars of its cage, then the collaborators were the jailers who carried the keys. They were not all Germans. Many were French. And in some neighborhoods, it was not the Wehrmacht or the Gestapo that Parisians feared most, but their own countrymen, the milice. The milice was a paramilitary force created in 1943 under the authority of the Vichy regime. Its mission was simple: to root out the resistance, to hunt down deserters from the compulsory labor service, to crush any flicker of rebellion before it could spread. Their leader, Joseph Darnand, was a veteran of the First World War, a man once decorated for bravery. But under the occupation, he pledged loyalty not to France, but to Hitler. He and his men swore personal oaths to the Führer. The milice were feared because they were not bound by even the thin veneer of German military law. They were Frenchmen who knew the streets, the language, the culture. They could blend in, overhear conversations, infiltrate meetings. And they were often more brutal than the Germans themselves, eager to prove their loyalty to their new masters. They tortured without hesitation, executed without trial, and betrayed neighbors for ration cards, money, or simply for the thrill of power. It is easy from a distance of decades to condemn them all as traitors. And many were. Yet the truth, as always, was more complicated. Some joined into the milice out of ideology drawn to fascism and its promises of order and strength. Others joined to escape the STO, believing that hunting the resistance was preferable to working as a slave in a German factory. Some were driven by poverty. Membership guaranteed better rations, protection for one's family, and the opportunity to settle old scores. In the chaos of occupation, betrayal could be disguised as patriotism. For the resistance, the presence of the milice was both a curse and a cruel irony. Fighting the Germans was dangerous enough, but at least they were an occupying enemy. To face Frenchmen, men who spoke your language, who might have once been your classmates or co-workers, this was another kind of wound. It was as though the nation had turned against itself, tearing apart the bonds of community. The historian Julian Jackson described collaboration in France as a war within a war. It was not just France against Germany, but Frenchmen against Frenchmen, neighbor against neighbor. A whispered word could mean a midnight knock at the door. A petty grudge could become a death sentence. And in the dungeons of the Hotel Majestic, those arrested often faced the unspeakable. Survivors recalled electric shocks, beatings, days without food or water, the screams of others echoing through the corridors. Torture became routine, a method not only of extracting information but of sowing fear. The milice were not the only collaborators. In the salons of Paris, wealthy industrialists made deals with German officers supplying steel, coal, or manufactured goods for the Reich's war effort. Some claimed they were merely protecting their businesses, keeping their factories alive until the war ended. But the line between survival and profiteering was thin. Others collaborated for more personal reasons. Coco Chanel, the queen of Parisian fashion, was rumored to have carried on a relationship with a German officer, though her true loyalties remain debated to this day. Collaboration left scars that would linger long after the war ended. For some, it was a desperate compromise, born of hunger and fear. For others, it was a willing embrace of the occupier's ideology. But for the resistance, for the millions who suffered it, was betrayal. And they swore that when liberation came, there would be a reckoning. Yet even here in this darkness, the story of Paris was not only one of treachery. For every collaborator who betrayed their countrymen, there were others who resisted quietly or openly at great personal risk. Some policemen tipped off families before Gestapo raids. Some bureaucrats lost files that would have condemned their neighbors. Even in the milice, there were men who secretly passed information to the resistance, walking a razor's edge between loyalty and survival. Still, the scars of collaboration ran deep. After the war, France would struggle with this wound. Tens of thousands of men and women were accused of collaboration. Some had indeed served the occupiers, willingly committing crimes against their own people. Others were guilty only of compromise, of trying to survive in an impossible situation. Sorting truth from lies, justice from vengeance would be one of the great traumas of liberation. For now, though, in 1943 and 1944, the collaborators walked the streets with an arrogance that cut the French to the bone. They wore armbands with the milice insignia, carried pistols at their sides, and strutted beside German soldiers as if they were equals. They believed their power would last forever. They believed they had secured their place in the new Europe Hitler promised. They were wrong, because just as the Germans had overplayed their hand with hunger and forced labor, so too had the collaborators overplayed theirs. Their brutality only deepened the hatred the French people felt not only toward the occupiers, but toward those who had betrayed their own blood. When the day of reckoning finally came, when the tricolor once again flew from the Arc de Triomphe, the collaborators would discover that the power they had borrowed from the Germans was an illusion. And in the days that followed liberation, their reckoning would be swift, merciless, and unforgettable. By the summer of 1944, the storm that had rumbled on the western horizon finally broke. The Allies had crossed the Channel. On June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy erupted in fire and steel as British, American, Canadian, and Free French troops hurled themselves against Hitler's Atlantic Wall. It was the beginning of the end. For the Germans, it was a nightmare realized. For the French resistance, it was the moment they had been waiting for. In the weeks that followed D-Day, as Allied divisions carved their way inland through the bocage hedgerows, the resistance sprang into action. Across France, they cut railway lines, blew up bridges, ambushed convoys, and sabotaged telegraph wires. In some cases, these were small acts: a single grenade tossed beneath a German truck, a single rail removed from a track, but multiplied across a nation, they became decisive. German reinforcements could not move. Supplies could not reach the front. The mighty Wehrmacht began to look less like an unstoppable machine and more like a beast hemmed in by 1,000 tiny cuts. By July, the Allies had broken through at Saint-Lô, and by August, they were sweeping toward Paris. The city itself was seething. In cafes, resistance fighters passed coded notes beneath saucers. In basements, weapons captured from German soldiers were hidden in coal bins. By mid-August, the resistance in Paris, once a scattered collection of students, workers, and intellectuals, was preparing to rise in open rebellion. On August 19th, they struck. Members of the French forces of the interior seized police stations, post offices, and government buildings. They tore down German flags and raised the tricolor in their place. Barricades sprang up in the streets, cobbled together from overturned cars, furniture, and paving stones. Old men and young boys alike carried rifles or pistols, while women carried ammunition, bandages, and food. For the first time in 4 years, the streets of Paris rang not only with the boots of occupiers, but with the gunfire of Frenchmen reclaiming their city. The Germans were caught off guard. They still had thousands of troops in Paris, but their spirit was broken. Many officers were exhausted, demoralized by years of fighting and by the knowledge that the war was turning against them. Yet Hitler had issued strict orders Paris was not to fall. If necessary, it was to be reduced to rubble rather than surrendered intact. The German governor of Paris, General Dietrich von Choltitz, received explicit instructions to blow up bridges, monuments, even the Eiffel Tower itself. Paris, Hitler insisted, must not be allowed to survive as a functioning city. Von Choltitz faced a choice. He could obey, turning one of Europe's greatest cities into a graveyard of stone and ash, or he could defy his Führer. In the end, he chose defiance not out of love for France, but out of calculation and perhaps a recognition of the futility of further destruction. When the resistance and the advancing Free French forces under General Philippe Leclerc closed in on the city, von Choltitz opened negotiations. On August 25, 1944, he surrendered Paris rather than destroy it. The moment was electric. Bells rang out across the city for the first time in 4 years. Crowds poured into the streets, weeping, laughing, embracing strangers. Tricolor flags hidden for years in attics and cellars were suddenly everywhere, draped from windows, waved from rooftops, pinned to lapels. The City of Light had been reborn, and then came the moment that would be etched into history. On August 26th, Charles de Gaulle, tall and unyielding, marched down the Champs-Élysées at the head of a parade. Around him surged a sea of Parisians, their cheers echoing off the walls of the Arc de Triomphe. German snipers still lingered on rooftop shots, occasionally cracking through the air, but the crowd did not scatter. Instead, they pressed closer, defiant, determined to witness their city's resurrection. It was a scene of chaos and triumph all at once. Resistance fighters rode captured German tanks draped in French flags. Young women climbed lampposts to wave banners. Old men who had fought at Verdun raised their canes in salute. And in the center, de Gaulle walked, tall, aloof, a symbol of continuity between the fallen Third Republic and the reborn France. Paris. Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated. He declared, his voice ringing with a mixture of pride and defiance. The liberation of Paris was not a clean victory. Gunfire still echoed through the side streets. German snipers picked off civilians from hidden windows, but the tide had turned. For 4 years, Parisians had been told that silence was the only way to obey, only way to survive. Now, their voices rose in song, La Marseillaise, sung not in whispers, but shouted to the heavens. The city that had been forced to live by Berlin's clock now kept its own time again, marked by the pealing of its church bells and the roar of its liberated people. And yet, beneath the joy, there was something darker stirring. The day of liberation was also the beginning of a reckoning. For years, Parisians had watched some of their own collaborate with the occupiers, spying, informing, profiteering, even joining the milice. Now, with the Germans gone, the people turned their fury inward. Collaborators were dragged into the streets, their heads shaved, their clothes torn, their reputations destroyed. Some were beaten, some executed without trial. Women accused of horizontal collaboration relationships with German soldiers were humiliated, their hair shorn as crowds jeered. The city was free, but it was also raw with anger. The scars of occupation could not be erased with flags and parades. Too much had been stolen: food, art, dignity, lives. Too many wounds remained open. Still, the liberation of Paris was a moment of undeniable triumph, a testament to the endurance of a people who had lived for years under the shadow of fear and hunger. It was proof that chains could be broken, that silence could give way to song, that even in the darkest night the dawn will come. The Germans had tried to break France by stealing its time, its bread, its men, and its soul. But in the end, it was not Paris that was destroyed. It was the Reich. And as the people of Paris cheered their liberation, they were not only celebrating the end of occupation, they were celebrating the rebirth of hope. The liberation of Paris was a moment of jubilation, but it was not the end of France's ordeal. Victory had come, yes, but at a cost so staggering it would take decades to reckon with. By the war's end, the human toll was immense. Nearly 150,000 French civilians had perished during the occupation, many of them victims not of combat, but of hunger disease and reprisal. Of these, around 30,000 were executed by the Germans, shot against walls, or killed in massacres for alleged resistance. Another 60,000 died fighting with the resistance itself, young men and women who had chosen to gamble their lives for freedom. These were not soldiers in uniform. They were students with notebooks still ink-stained from the classroom, farmers with dirt under their fingernails, mothers with children waiting at home. And then there were the collaborators. Their fate became one of the darkest chapters in the story of liberation. When the Allies rolled into Paris and the swastika was torn down from the Eiffel Tower, the long simmering anger of the French people erupted. Vigilante justice was swift and merciless. Women accused of sleeping with German soldiers were dragged into the streets, their heads shaved, their faces painted with swastikas. Some were paraded through the boulevards, spat upon, jeered at, humiliated. Men accused of betrayal were hauled before makeshift tribunals, sometimes courts of law, sometimes mobs in the street. Historians estimate that around 10,000 French citizens were executed for collaboration in the months following liberation. Some had truly betrayed their countrymen, denouncing Jews to the Gestapo, joining the milice, profiting from the suffering of their neighbors. Others were guilty only of compromise, of trying to survive under impossible conditions, or of love affairs that the crowd deemed treason. In the heat of liberation, justice blurred into vengeance. This period became known as the épuration sauvage, the wild purge. It was a raw, chaotic settling of scores, a catharsis born of years of humiliation. Later, the official French government would attempt to bring order to this reckoning through the épuration légale, the legal purge. Trials were held, evidence presented, sentences passed. Some collaborators were imprisoned, others were barred from public office. A few, including Marshal Pétain himself, were tried for treason. Pétain, once the hero of Verdun, was condemned to death for betraying France. His sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, but the judgment was clear. His legacy was forever stained. Other leaders of the Vichy regime were executed, their names becoming synonymous with betrayal. For decades after the war, the question of collaboration would haunt France, a wound that reopened with every new revelation, every trial, every whispered accusation. But the cost of freedom was not measured only in blood and justice. It was measured in stone and steel. The Allied bombing campaigns that had preceded liberation had devastated much of France's infrastructure. Railways lay in ruins, bridges had been blown apart, factories were reduced to rubble. Cities like Caen-le Havre and Saint-Lô were almost obliterated in the fighting. Even Paris spared destruction by von Choltitz's disobedience bore scars, bullet holes in its walls, shattered windows, burned out buildings. And yet, even amid the ruins, there was life. Markets reopened. Cafes set out chairs on sidewalks, once again serving real coffee, real bread, real wine. Families returned from the countryside, trickling back into the city to reclaim their homes. Children who had grown up under occupation suddenly heard the bells of Paris ring out. In freedom, saw the tricolor flying openly for the first time in their memory. The joy was immense, but so too was the challenge. France was free, but France was broken. The question now was not survival, but rebirth. Could a nation so deeply wounded its population, divided its infrastructure, shattered its pride, bruised, rise again? History tells us that it did. Within a generation, France would rebuild. The Marshall Plan would pour American aid into Europe. Railways and factories would be rebuilt. New industries would rise from the ruins of the old. By the 1950s, France was once again an industrial power. And by the 1960s, under Charles de Gaulle, it had reasserted itself as one of Europe's leading nations. But the scars of occupation never fully faded. Even today, the ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane remain untouched, preserved exactly as they were on the day of the massacre. Walking its silent streets is like stepping into a nightmare, frozen in time. Rusted bicycles leaning against charred walls, sewing machines lying in the rubble of homes. The stone shell of the church where women and children were burned alive. It is a wound in the French landscape, a reminder of the price of freedom. The occupation had tried to rob France of everything: its time, its bread, its art, its men, its dignity. For 4 years, the city of Paris had lived in silence under curfew and hunger and humiliation. And yet, through it all, the spirit of the French people endured. When the bells of Notre-Dame rang out on that August day in 1944, when de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées, when Parisians once again sang La Marseillaise at the top of their lungs, it was not only the liberation of a city, it was the resurrection of a nation. Freedom had returned, but it had not come cheaply. It had been bought with hunger, with blood, with betrayal, and with fire. It had been written into the very stones of villages left in ruins, into the silence of empty chairs at dinner tables, into the scarred faces of survivors. And yet, in the end, the occupiers had failed. They had stolen time, but they could not stop the dawn. They had stolen food, but they could not starve hope. They had stolen art, but they could not erase the spirit of creation. They had stolen men and women, but they could not destroy the will to resist. France was broken, yes, but in that brokenness, it found strength. From the ashes of occupation, it rose again, first in defiance, then in liberation, and finally in rebirth. Within a few decades, it stood among the founders of NATO, a leader in Europe, a symbol once again not of defeat, but of resilience. The story of occupied Paris is not only a tale of suffering, it is a story of endurance, of the human spirit refusing to surrender. It is the reminder that tyranny, no matter how absolute it appears, is never eternal. Take a walk today through the ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane, and you will hear it. The silence is heavy, but beneath it lies a message carved into the stones by fire and blood. Freedom is never free, but it is always worth the cost. And perhaps as you stand in that silence, you will understand what the people of Paris already knew on that moonlit night in August 1944. That even when the clocks are stolen, even when the streets are silent, even when the bread is gone, the human spirit waits. And when its hour comes, it rises, unbroken, unstoppable, unafraid. Paris, the city of light, had endured the darkness, and in enduring it, taught the world a lesson as old as history itself. Empires rise and fall, but the will of a free people cannot be conquered.